Hello everyone, my name is Gabriel Weindl and I'm going to present you my PhD thesis titled on the measurement and estimation of cognitive processes with electrophysiological recordings and reaction time modeling. So this thesis was conducted under the supervision of Xavier Alario and Boris Pur at Aix-Marseille University in the Laboratoire de Psychologie Cognitive and Laboratoire de Neurosciences Cognitives. So let's start with what are the cognitive processes we are talking about. So cognitive processes are information processing units that are thought to be contained in the mind. For example, when I present a stimulus to a participant, it is expected that there are some operation on the information coming from stimulus that are operated on, and that these processing units allow the participant to produce a response. Problem is that these cognitive processes are latent theoretical construct. Namely, we don't have directly access to these cognitive processes. We have to build theory on how we think they are organized and what they are. So to study these cognitive processes, both in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, there is a measure that is often used. It's the reaction time. So the time that is happening between the onset of the stimulus, presentation of the stimulus to the participant, and the recording of the response. The logic behind the use of reaction times is well illustrated by the quotation by Joseph Jastrow, as outlined here. If the processing of the mind is highly structured, then different paths through that structure will entail different time courses, and those differences will be reflected in the reaction time. So we want to measure the reaction time to see what cognitive processes are in the mind of the participants performing the task. And in this thesis, we are particularly focused and interested in the cognitive processes involved in decision-making. So how does a participant choose between multiple alternatives and provide a decision? What are the information processing that is happening between the presentation of the stimuli and the decision? So the problem is when studying decisions is that both reaction times and decisions are variable. Decision can be defined, for example, as correct choice or incorrect choice. And when you present the same participants to the same stimulus, then on different trials, then on each trial you will have different reaction time and even sometimes different decisions, sometimes correct, sometimes incorrect. So this is the first problem. We have this variability that we need to account for when we study cognitive processes of decision-making. Along is another problem is the ability of participants to trade accuracy for speed. For example, we could have one participant that is cautious and slow, it doesn't make a lot of errors, and another one that is way faster but also commits more errors than the previous one. So this is called the speed accuracy trade-off, and it's a dimension we have to account for when we try to study the cognitive processes involved in decision-making. We try to account for both of these dimensions, the variability on one side and the speed accuracy trade-off on the other side. But there is one theoretical framework that tries to account for both dimensions. It's the evidence accumulation framework. So this framework started with the work, arguably, of Abraham Wald, a statistician in the Second War, which was asked to design the optimal procedure to accept or reject a current product batch that was being manufactured. So what Abraham Wald tried to do is to say as quickly as possible, by taking the less sample possible, whether we should accept the manufacturing of a product batch or reject it. So what he will do would be to randomly sample one object of the production line, then test whether we should accept or reject that product. And he will continue repeatedly until enough information about the object he sampled has been accumulated to reach a decision threshold, whether we accept or reject the product batch. Well, psychologists in the mid-20th century have thought that perhaps human participants and other species also have the same mechanism when they make the decision. For example, this is illustrated by the model of Irving Stone in 1960, where he adapted the sequential probability ratio test of Abraham Wald to a psychological experiment involving human decision-making. What he was thinking is that, as for Abraham Wald, he thought that participants were sequentially sampling some information from the stimulus, evaluating whether this sample goes toward the correct threshold or toward the other threshold, could represent the incorrect response. And he will accumulate this evidence until one criterion is reached, which then terminates the decision. But the fact that we rely on some random sample of the information from the stimulus explains how we can have a variability in the time taken for the decision, and also how we can have a variability in the choice made. Sometimes we hit the correct threshold, sometimes we hit the incorrect threshold. So another ability of this model is to therefore account for the variability, but also explain how we could perform how participants can make a speed-up trade-off. For example, if you have a more liberal participant than the one I, for example, showed here, we can imagine that the decision thresholds are lower. Therefore, these participants would need less information before committing to a choice. This, in that case, would translate in a faster decision time, but also this participant will have committed an error because he wouldn't have sampled enough information. Among the models of evidence accumulation framework, the arguably most prolific and one of the focus of the talk is the drift diffusion model developed by Radcliffe in 1978. So in his model, the reaction time is thought to be the sum of three independent serial stages: a time needed to encode the stimulus, a time needed to decide, and a time to execute the response. So the time for the decision is, as in the model of Stone I showed you previously, defined by the time it takes for one decision, for one participant, to go from the starting point of the accumulation, where we start the information, to the crossing of a decision threshold. So this represents one decision, and in psychology experiments, we always have multiple decisions, which would be represented like this, where you have multiple paths representing each one a decision. Now, interestingly, in the case of the drift diffusion model, these decision variables, the decision paths, are determined by three mathematical parameters. The first one is the value at which the accumulation of evidence starts, which we call the starting point, or the Z parameter. Then we have another parameter, which is the drift rate, which drives the Brownian motion, meaning that we have a mean increase of the average decision path towards the correct threshold. And finally, what is explaining this variability in the decision path is the notion that we have a Gaussian noise with a standard deviation given by the C parameter, and that will explain that the decision path will go up or down randomly based on this Gaussian noise. So this determines the decision path, and all the decision paths stops once they reach either the positive value of the parameter A, which instantiates the decision threshold or of the correct response, or the negative value of the parameter A, which then would represent an incorrect response. So once I have defined this formalism, we can then derive a prediction of a model such as the drift diffusion model, for example, for the mean reaction time for one participant and the amount of correct responses he made. So this is given by the following. If we assume that the starting point of the evidence accumulation is equal to 0, then the mean reaction time is given by two terms of the addition. The first one is the mean decision time, so the mean time it takes for the participants to go from the starting point towards one of the threshold. And to that, we add the non-decision time, which is the term on the right, which then represents the sum of both the encoding stages, the pre-accumulation stages, and the post-accumulation stages, which are thought to represent the time needed to execute the response. So what is particularly interesting in these models is that they are linking basically the mean reaction time and the amount of proportion correct with the same parameter, with the drift rate, the threshold parameter, and the noise in the Brownian motion. We predict both the mean reaction time of the participant and the amount of proportion correct responses. Now, this formalism also gives some psychological interpretation, or at least some intuition on the way we should interpret these mathematical parameters. So usually we estimate 4 of them: the threshold, the drift rate, the starting point, and the non-decision time. And each one of them has a psychological interpretation. For the A parameter, the threshold, so the decision boundaries, would represent the quotient of response. If I ask my participants to be more accurate, then we think they will increase the threshold in order to comply to this instruction. The drift rate will represent the ease of processing. So how fast is the stimulus processed? For example, if I have an easy stimulus, I expect that this drift rate will be high, leading most passes towards the correct threshold in a fast way. If it's low, for example, then the decision path will be mainly driven by noise, making it randomly hit the correct or the incorrect threshold at given values of times. And finally, the last parameter that is going to be one of the focus of the talk is the non-decision time, which is thought to be the sum of the time needed to encode the stimulus and the time needed to execute the response, so pre and post accumulation times. So what we do is that when we have such kind of models, we use data from psychological experiments, and we fit the model using, amongst others, the equation I showed you above, to the data we recorded in the psychological experiments from different participants. So when you fit the model, you're basically giving parameter values in order to account for the data you have at hand. Once you have the value for these parameters, then you try to infer the cognitive processes they are supposed to encapsulate. So when you fit your model, you then use the value of the parameters to infer cognitive processes. For example, comparing two conditions, one where I ask my participants to be fast or one where I ask them to be accurate. Then you look at the value of the parameter of the boundaries, for example. So this is a way to go beyond the reaction time or just a number of correct responses and try to infer directly on the cognitive processes of the participants that are taking the task. But the general question of the thesis is the following. Can mathematical models of behavior, such as the one I presented to you, account for latent cognitive processes by estimating parameters on behavioral data? Well, this is the question we're going to try to answer, and some have already tried to provide answers. This notion of interpretability is defined by Myung and Pitt as the extent to which the values of a parameter refers to the value of the cognitive processes it is sought to capture. So when my parameters does vary between conditions, is it because the underlying process is indeed varying between conditions? So several studies have therefore manipulated given experimental factors that were known to affect the psychological process, and then looked at whether the model did capture the manipulation with the associated parameter, the parameter associated with the cognitive process. So for example, Roth, Waterman, and Voss in 2004 changed speed accuracy trade-off settings. Either they were asking participants to be accurate or they were asking them to be fast in order to try to change the decision threshold of the participants. And the model did indeed capture the modification as a change in the threshold parameter, suggesting that the interpretation made of the threshold parameter is indeed those of a decision threshold. Other authors have also changed decisional difficulty, hoping to induce different ease of processing of a stimulus, and indeed observe that the model did capture the change in a change of the drift rate. Other authors have changed the response output, expecting to induce different response execution time, either, for example, by providing a response with the hand or with the foot. And they indeed observed that the non-decision time did change with the response output manipulation, suggesting as non-decision time is sought to encode, to contain the motor execution processes, that indeed motor execution were contained in this parameter. And last study showed that the visibility of the stimulus, making it less or more visible, changed the non-decision time, again, which is coherent because we expect the non-decision time to contain the pre-accumulation time, so the time that is needed to encode the stimulus. But there is conflicting evidence on the correct attribution and selectivity of this manipulation. So these are not enough evidence to say that we can interpret cognitive processes by looking at parameter values. So in order to test the interpretability of a cognitive model, such as the drift diffusion model, we would need an external measure of the cognitive process. And this can be done by defining a linking function, which Scholl in 2019 defines as a formal articulation of the relationship between a neural process and a behavior or cognitive process. So we basically want to have a measure of cognitive process in order to compare this measure to the parameter that is supposed to implement the cognitive process. And in the thesis, we developed such a linking function. We did so by recording the electromyographical activity of the responding muscles. So you have it illustrated here on both thumbs of the participants. For example, we placed 2 electrodes on each thumb in order to see the electrical activity of the underlying muscles. This allows to decompose the reaction time, which is the time between the stimulus and the recording of the response, into 2 separate stages. One stage would be the time from the stimulus to the onset of the electrical activity in the muscles, showing that the participant is engaging in the response. So that's a pre-motor time. And one time from the onset of the muscular activity to the response recorded by the computer, which we call the motor time. Now, the linking function we have in mind is quite obvious. We think that this last motor time, the time where the participant is actively engaging in the response, should be the same as the time needed to execute the response that is assumed by the model. And we can then look whether the measure we make does correspond to the estimation that is made by the model of behavior. So therefore, if we expect, as we do, that the motor time should be equal to this time to execute the response, knowing that this time is part of the estimated non-decision time by the model, then we expect the following. We expect that decision parameters such as decision threshold and drift rate should be reflected in the pre-motor time, so before we start to engage in the response, and that the non-decision time parameter of the model should evolve like the measure we make of execution, response execution using EMG and the motor time. So any violation of this expectation can only be explained either by a failure of the theory that the model is implementing or the linking function we define between motor time and response execution. So this is assuming that the violation does not stem from measurement error or some kind of opposing effects between the parts of non-decision time. So now in the next section, in the first section, we tested whether experimental manipulations that are associated with decision parameters, so thought to be contained in the premotor time, whether these affect the motor time we are recording. In the other subpart of this section, we then use the measured motor time to see whether it can predict the value that is estimated by the behavioral model by the estimation of the non-decision processes, using only reaction time and proportion correct. So a quick side note on the statistics used in the thesis. We used hierarchical Bayesian methods that allow to estimate population parameters, so for example, the effect of speed accuracy trade-off, the slope of speed accuracy trade-off, and the L posterior distribution, so that we have probability for different values of the speed accuracy trade-off effect, knowing the data, the model, and the prior. So you will see such kind of representation, which shows, for example, 2 effects. We call them forest plots. And these represent 2 effects and the effect sizes on the x-axis, along with the different credible values we have for this effect. So for example, here we would have an effect which most likeliest value are on positive effect sizes, while this one would be around 0. So there is an uncertainty of whether there is any effect. So we used linear mixed models for the factor effects and hierarchical Bayesian estimation of the drift diffusion model parameters using HTDM. So let's start with the first section where we try to link model and physiology. We recorded the EMG of the thumbs of the participants and asked them to respond to such kind of stimulus. They had a patch on the left and the right side of a fixation cause and had to say which of these patch had the most contrast in it. They then indicated the response either by pressing the left button or the right button. And we decomposed each reaction time, each decision as a premotor component and a motor component, motor time. So for the experimental factors, we manipulated speed accuracy trade-off in an experiment with 16 participants and asked them either to be fast or to be accurate. We also manipulated the decisional difficulty, ranging from really easy trials to hard trials, where we simply increase or decreased the difference between both patches. We replicated these both of these manipulations in a second experiment with again 16 participants and just adjusted the level of force that participants needed to apply, just to see whether these results generalizes to a more canonical setting. And in the last part of this section, we fitted a drift diffusion model using the by-trial motor time as a regressor on the non-decision time. So for the effect of decision-related experimental factors, we first see that here on the left, you have the mean motor time. On the right, the mixed mode coefficients that I will explain shortly. When you look at the mean motor time value that is recorded for the participants, you can first look at the difference between both columns. This is the condition where we ask participants to be accurate. This is the condition where we ask them to be fast. And what we observe is that the mean motor time, so the average time it takes participants to execute the response using EMG, is shorter when we ask participants to speed up. And this is illustrated by the coefficients here on the right side, where you see that we have on average 15 milliseconds difference between an accuracy where we emphasize speed and a condition where we emphasize accuracy. So now on the next effect, we can look at the effect of the contrast difference. So going from a hard trial to an easy trial. And for that, I ask you to first focus on the blue line, which represents the correct response. We see that the mean motor time in both conditions decreases as the easiness of the trial increases. So meaning that when the trial was easy, participants did execute the response faster than when it was a hard trial. And we see the last effect we can see is that there is a difference between when the participants made a correct response versus when he made an incorrect response, as you have a difference between error and correct responses. So this suggests that participants were slower to execute the response when they were making an error compared to when they were making a correct response. This is nicely replicated in the second experiment where we have the same pattern of data and coefficients that are closely aligned one to each other. So now what about the modeling, the behavior, the use of the behavioral model? Well, we try to predict the estimation the model makes about non-decision processes given the value of the motor times. And what we observe in both experiments is the following. We have a linear link between motor time measured using EMG and non-decision time estimated by the model, again on behavior alone. What we see is that on average, when we increase the motor time by 1 unit, we increase the non-decision time estimated by approximately 0.2 or 0.3 units. So this shows that the bi-trial motor time and non-decision time are linearly related. So first discussion, we saw that the response execution time measured with EMG is sensitive to decisional factors such as speed-action trade-off, contrast, and correctness. This implies the following: either these effects are not selective to decisional aspects of the reaction time, or the linking function we provided between motor time and the time needed to the non-decision time is wrong. So this is the first comment we have to do. And when we look at the non-decision time parameter, well, the fact that it co-varies with an external measure of the same process of response execution, well, this does give a meaningful correspondence between drift diffusion model and electromyographical decomposition, suggesting that, as is assumed by the model, non-decision time does indeed reflect the intended time for the motor execution. Now we wanted to go a bit further and extended the test we applied. We want always to know whether the motor time is the time that the model assumed is dedicated to execute the response. We therefore manipulated the force that the participants had to apply in order to provide the response. Either they had to apply a strong pressure on the button or a weak pressure. We expect that if the motor time and the time to execute the response estimated by the model are the same, well, then they should vary in the same way based on this manipulation. So motor time should evolve with the force manipulation as the non-decision time. So therefore, we manipulated again with 16 participants speed-action trade-off and the force required, strong versus weak. And we also manipulated brightness of stimulus, but that will be next section. And we replicated a new experiment with 20 participants and also measured electroencephalography, but that will also be seen in the next section. So now about the effect of force on motor time versus on the non-decision time. What you see here is that when we go from a weak to a strong pressure to apply, the motor time increases both in the accuracy and the speed condition. And it does so in a rather high, with a rather high effect size, because we have approximately a 100 milliseconds difference between a weak pressure and a strong pressure in the accuracy condition and slightly less in the speed condition. Additionally, we see in the difference between the slopes that we also have a speed accuracy trade-off effect, as in the previous section, saying that when I ask participants to speed up, their motor time is shorter. So what happens for the model? What is he estimating on what he thinks is the motor execution? Well, we observe again these results showing that the model did correctly see that the time needed to execute the response is increased when we go from a weak force to a strong force. Interestingly, it is slightly less though than the motor time we are recording, and we see that the speed accuracy trade-off in turn has a higher effect on non-decision time than it has on the motor time. So in the second part, we further test the link and try the following analysis. We want to fit the drift diffusion model on the pre-motor time of the reaction time only. The idea is that we call the pre-motor time is the time happening before the response execution. When we think that if motor time is equal to the time needed for the execution of the response assumed by the model, then removing the motor time on each trial should only change the estimation of the non-decision processes, because the time to execute the response is contained in this parameter. So well, let's take a look at it. We compare the fits we have on reaction time versus pre-motor time on the non-decision time parameter. This is a graph I showed you previously when we estimate non-decision time on reaction time, as is usually done. And this is the same parameter when we estimate it on the pre-motor time. And we see that the value is highly reduced and that there is no longer a sensitivity to the force condition, so coherent with the fact that we removed the motor processes. And also we see that there is still a speed accuracy trade-off effect. However, things are not as expected when we look at a decision-related parameter, and especially the decision threshold. We see that when we go from a fit on reaction time to a fit on pre-motor time, the value is changed. There is no real dependency of the decision threshold with a weak and strong force condition. But however, when we fit on the pre-motor time, then all of a sudden we have a sensitivity of this decision threshold to the force manipulation. What is important as decision-related parameter A changes when we fit on the pre-motor time compared to a fit on the reaction time. So again, a discussion, we see first that the speed accuracy trade-off effect we found on the non-decision process estimated by the model are higher than the one we see on the motor time. This could mean simply that processes that are sensitive to speed accuracy trade-off are still contained in the non-decision time, even if we remove the motor time. So it could be that the encoding processes are sensitive to speed accuracy trade-off, and we're going to test that in the next section. So also we observed this time the reverse, that the effect of force is higher on the motor time than it is on the estimates made by the model. This suggests that the motor time contains more than only the time needed to execute the response that is estimated by the model. And it's coherent with the fact that the boundary parameter A changes between a fit on reaction time and pre-motor time. This does show that part of the decision time that is assumed by the model is contained in the motor time we are recording using EMG. So this makes a direct prediction. If the model is right, if there is some decision contained when we start to press the button, then we would expect that when we extend the delay during which we press a button, we should also extend the amount of correct responses made by the participants, because he has more decision time. This then predicts that we should have an effect of the amount of correct responses that the participant made when we increase the force needed to produce a response. This is indeed what you see when you look at here. You have the y-axis of amount of correct responses the participant made, both accuracy and speed condition, for the different force emphasis, for the different force condition. And you see that in the speed condition, especially, going from a weak to a strong force increase the amount of correct response made by the participants, suggesting that participants are using this time, this additional time, to increase their amount of correct responses. And this is also nicely observed on the replication, where we have again this effect on the number of correct responses in the speed condition only. So let's move to the last section about encoding processes. So we have dealt about the time needed to execute the response. Now we are interested in what's happening before the accumulation. So what we did was that in the same experiment where we manipulated the force needed to respond, so both original and replication studies, we manipulated the overall contrast of stimulus. So we increased or decreased the overall contrast of the stimulus, making it more or less visible. Why did we do that? Well, because we know that the visual encoding speed of the stimulus is linked to the stimulus brightness. For example, this is data from Renaud, Masson, and Chavan of the activity of the V1 area in monkey, and V1 area in monkeys is the primary visual cortex. And they showed that the onset of this visual cortex is function of the contrast of the stimulus. The onset of the neurons, so when they start to discharge, is negatively related to the increase in contrast. So what we expect is that if the non-decision time contains the time needed to encode the stimulus, then when we increase the contrast, we should decrease the estimation of the non-decision time, given that it contains the time needed to encode the stimulus. So this is kind of what we observe. When you look first at the speed condition, you see that participants are, that the model is estimating a decreasing non-decision time when we increase the contrast. So as in the data with the monkey. When we look at the accuracy conditions, or when we ask participants to favor accuracy, we do not have this relationship anymore. And this is observed in the original experiments and also in the replication experiments that contain a bit less contrast levels. You see again, no clear relation between non-decision time and contrast, but you see one when you ask participants to speed up. So this pattern of decrease, this high decrease at the beginning and the low decrease at the end, kind of reminded us of the data from the monkey I presented you earlier. So what we did was to try to see whether both are related. The estimation of non-decision processes in humans only using behavior and the data of visual primary cortex area in monkeys. So we basically centered everything to zero and looked whether the evolution of non-decision time was the same as the one we observed, the one the authors observed in the monkeys. And you see in red the original experiment and in purple the replication study. So the estimation made by the drift diffusion model. And you see that it really nicely aligns with actual data recorded in monkey in visual cortex area, which is kind of surprising. You even have an R-square of 0.99, suggesting a high degree of coherence with monkey data. This is especially true when we ask participants to apply a weak force condition, and less true, but still true, when we ask participants to apply a high pressure on the button. And a reminder, this is all only in the speed condition because in the accuracy condition, we don't see a decreasing non-decision time. So now we wanted to, last extension promised, we tried to make a linking function for this first pre-accumulation part that is thought to be the time needed to encode the stimulus. Therefore, we recorded electrical brain potential using electroencephalography. And more particularly, we looked at the single trial measure of an electrical potential that is linked to visual stimulus processing, the N200. We expect that this N200, which is a negative ongoing wave happening around 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset, should behave as what the model is assuming as the encoding time. So let's look at the factor effects on this component. We see that both in accuracy condition and speed condition, higher contrast are processed faster because you have a faster N200 than lower contrast, both in accuracy and speed condition. And this is captured by the following coefficients, where you have a negative relation between contrast and the N200. And you also see, although it's not easy to see on this graph, that we have a small speed accuracy trade-off on the encoding processes as expected. So the N200 is sensitive to speed accuracy trade-off and contrast in both speed and accuracy conditions. So this new linking function adds the following conclusions. First, the contrast effect is present based on the N200, so the physiological measure of encoding time is present in both speed accuracy trade-off conditions, contrary to what is suggested by the drift diffusion model non-decision time parameter. So it could be that speed accuracy trade-off actually changes the nature of the non-decision time that is estimated by the model, but more on that later. Additionally, a bit in the same discussion, we see that the speed accuracy trade-off on non-decision time is again higher than the one we estimate on the N200 for the physiological time for encoding the stimulus. So remember that in the previous section, we were saying that the motor time had also a smaller effect than the non-decision time of speed accuracy trade-off. So this shows that the residual speed accuracy trade-off effect we observed in the previous section is not only linked to encoding processes. In fact, if we compare the estimation we have of speed accuracy trade-off difference on N200 and on the motor time using EMG, we see that it is lower than the one that is estimated by the model on the non-decision processes. So first, let's try to sum up a bit the results, and then we'll suggest some theoretical proposition, try to answer the general question, and discuss the consequences and perspectives of the work. So first, we have shown that motor time has its own variability, and that it is a reliable measure, as shown by the successful replication we did across the experiments. We also saw that the motor time is sensitive to factors associated with decision threshold usually and the drift rate. And we also showed that there is sensitivity to the starting point, but this is a study that I did not have time to show to you. So the results also show that there is a continuation of the decision, as when we fit the drift diffusion model on the pre-motor time, we are not only affecting the non-decision processes, but also the decision process, such as the boundaries. And also when we observe that lengthening the motor time increases the amount of correct responses, and this altogether suggests that participants are still accumulating evidence while the execution is ongoing. So this translates as follows. Given these results, we give the following theoretical proposition, the first theoretical proposition, which is that motor execution is not a ballistic process as often assumed by a psychophysiologist. It is not also purely sequential to the decision, so it doesn't follow necessarily in a strict manner the decision. And however, and this is a kind of a new proposition, we think that the course of this motor execution signs the end of the decision. So this gives approximately the following representation. We have an evidence accumulation as formalized by evidence accumulation models, and also some evidence accumulation models. Then we have an engaging in the response execution that we are recording using EMG, but it seems that the accumulation is continuing because when we increase the time needed to execute the response, then there is sometimes where participants are more accurate than others. Now let's move on to the second theoretical proposition that concerns the speed accuracy trade-off. We have seen, and previous authors before us have already seen that both the N200 and the motor time, so the physiological time needed to encode and to execute the response, are sensitive to speed accuracy trade-off conditions. We also saw, which is interesting, that the speed accuracy trade-off breaks the relationship between contrast of the stimulus and non-decision processes. And we also, again, saw that the effect on non-decision time is higher on the effect of speed accuracy trade-off on this non-decision time is higher than the one we observe on the motor time and on the N200. So altogether, we want to make the following proposition. Perhaps that speed accuracy trade-off might actually add an extra non-decisional process, and that we think should be pre-decisional. To show you what we think is that in the speed condition, everything seems to happen as the model is thinking. We have an encoding time, an accumulation of evidence, but in the accuracy, to explain the fact that there is a longer delay of non-decision process and the fact that we break the prediction between contrast and non-decision time, well, we think that something like this could happen, that there is an additional stage that is placed before the decision. So now what about the general question I asked about the ability of mathematical models of behavior to account for latent cognitive processes by estimating parameters? Well, the first answer to the question is yes, we can do so, because as we showed, there is a link between motor execution and the time that is estimated for the model. We also saw that when we have a force manipulation, so when we manipulate the motor processes, the model correctly captures the effect of force increase, and not when we fit on the premotor time. And we also see that striking resemblance between monkey encoding data and our estimation made using the model. So yes, in our case, the parameters of the model does show something about the cognitive process. However, we also found that several assumptions are false. First, motor time is definitely not simply equal to the time needed to execute the response that is assumed by the model. And neither is it purely serial to the decision. So this is the first theoretical proposition. This refers to the first theoretical proposition. And finally, non-decision time is related to motor and encoding processes, as I was showing earlier, but not completely determined by them. And this refers to the second theoretical proposition. And finally, again, on this second theoretical proposition, explaining Spirachi trade-off only through a threshold adjustment, which is the cornerstone of evidence accumulation models, is clearly an oversimplification. Whether it remains useful remains to be determined. So the consequences are the following to me. To the non-serial nature of decision and motor execution, so the fact that they are not strictly following each other, yields an impossible separation when we are using a serial model. Additionally, we cannot know for sure what non-decision time is because it does not completely vary with what we measured as encoding and motor processes. However, it is clearly a residual time that is diagnostically important. So now about the perspectives for the work. Well, we want to derive the generative model that can account for the parallel nature of motor time and the time needed for decision. We also would like to evaluate the impact of the present findings on previous studies relying on the interpretation of the non-decision time parameters, such as Spirachi trade-off or aging. And we want to account for the nature of the effects on the motor time. For example, we have another line of work with other collaborators where we are looking at the confidence in the response might explain some results we observe on the motor time. So thank you for your attention, and thanks to the many people that permitted this work.